Book 2, Chapter 2 of The Food of the Gods and How It Came to Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alex C. Talander, Davis, California. The Food of the Gods and How It Came to Earth by H. G. Wells. Book 2, Chapter 2 The Brat Gigantic. 1. The giant child was ugly. The vicar would insist. He always had been ugly, as all excessive things must be. The vicar's views had carried him out of sight of just judgment in this matter. The child was much subjected to snapshots, even in that rustic retirement, and their net testimony is against the vicar, testifying that the young monster was at first almost pretty, with a copious curl of hair reaching to his brow and a great readiness to smile. Usually Cattles, who was slightly built, stands smiling behind the baby, perspective emphasizing his relative smallness. After the second year, the good looks of the child became more subtle and more contestable. He began to grow, as his unfortunate grandfather would no doubt have put it, rank. He lost colour and developed an increasing effect of being somehow, albeit colossal, yet slight. He was vastly delicate. His eyes and something about his face grew finer, grew, as people say, interesting. His hair, after one cutting, began to tangle into a mat. "It's the degenerate strain coming out in him," said the parish doctor, marking these things. But just how far he was right in that, and just how far the youngster's lapse from ideal healthfulness was the result of living entirely in a whitewashed barn upon Lady Wondershoot's sense of charity tempered by justice, is open to question. The photographs of him that present him from 3 to 6 show him developing into a round-eyed, flaxen-haired youngster, with a truncated nose and a friendly stare. There are lurks about his lips that never very remote promise of a smile that all the photographs of the early giant children display. In summer he wears loose garments of ticking tack together with string. There is usually one of those straw baskets upon his head that workmen use for their tools, and he is barefooted. In one picture he grins broadly and holds a bitten melon in his hand. The winter pictures are less numerous and satisfactory. He wears huge sabots, no doubt of beechwoods, and, as fragments of the inscription John Stickles, Epping, show, sacks for socks, and his trousers and jacket are unmistakably cut from the remains of a gaily patterned carpet. Underneath that there were rude swathings of flannel. 5 or 6 yards of flannel are tied comforter fashion about his neck. The thing on his head is probably another sack. He stares, sometimes smiling, sometimes a little ruefully, at the camera. Even when he was only 5 years old, one sees that half-whimsical wrinkling over his soft brown eyes that characterized his face. He was from the first, the vicar always declared, a terrible nuisance about the village. He seems to have had a proportionate impulse to play, much curiosity and sociability, and in addition there was a certain craving within him, I grieve to say, for more to eat. In spite of what Mrs. Greenfield called an excessively generous allowance of food from Lady Wondershoot, he displayed what the doctor perceived at once was the criminal appetite. It carries out only too completely Lady Wondershoot's worst experiences of the lower classes, that in spite of an allowance of nourishment inordinately beyond what is known to be the maximum necessity even of an adult human being, the creature was found to steal. And what he stole he ate with an inelegant voracity. His great hand would come over garden walls, he would covet the very bread in the baker's carts. Cheeses went from Marlowe's store loft, and never a pig trough was safe from him. Some farmer walking over his fields of Swedes would find the great spoor of his feet and the evidence of his nibbling hunger, a root picked here, a root picked there, and the holes, with childish cunning, heavily erased. He ate a Swede as one devours a radish. He would stand and eat apples from a tree, if no one was about, as normal children eat blackberries from a bush. In one way, at any rate, this shortness of provisions was good for the piece of cheesy eyebright. For many years he ate up every grain very nearly of the food of the gods that was given him. Indisputably the child was troublesome and out of place. He was always about, the vicar used to say. He could not go to school, he could not go to church by virtue of the obvious limitations of its cubical content. There was some attempt to satisfy the spirit of that most foolish and destructive law, I quote the vicar, the Elementary Education Act of 1870, by getting him to sit outside the open window while instruction was going on within. But his presence there destroyed the discipline of the other children. They were always popping up and peering at him, and every time he spoke they laughed together. His voice was so odd, so they let him stay away. Nor did they persist in pressing him to come to church, for his vast proportions were of little help to devotion. Yet there they might have had an easier task. There are good reasons for guessing there were the germs of religious feeling somewhere in the big carcass. The music perhaps drew him. He was often in the churchyard on a Sunday morning, picking his way softly among the graves after the congregation had gone in, and he would sit the whole service out beside the porch, listening as one listens outside a hive of bees. At first he showed a certain want of tact; the people inside would hear his great feet crunch restlessly round their place of worship, or become aware of his dim face peering in through the stained glass, half curious, half envious, and at times some simple hymn would catch him unawares, and he would howl lugubriously in a gigantic attempt at unison. Whereupon little Sloppet, who was an organ blower and verger and beadle and sexton and bell ringer on Sundays, besides being postman and chimney sweep all the week, would go out very briskly and valiantly and send him mournfully away. Sloppet, I am glad to say, felt it in his more thoughtful moments at any rate. It was like sending a dog home when you start out for a walk, he told me. But the intellectual moral training of young Cattles, though fragmentary, was explicit. From the first, vicar, mother, and all the world combined to make it clear to him that his giant strength was not for use. It was a misfortune that he had to make the best of. He had to mind what was told him, do what was said him, be careful never to break anything nor hurt anything. Particularly he must not go treading on things, or jostling against things, or jumping about. He had to salute the gentlefolks respectful, and be grateful for the food and clothing they spared him out of their riches. And he learned all these things submissively, being but nature and habit a teachable creature, and only by food and accident gigantic. For Lady Wondershoot, in these early days, he displayed the profoundest awe. She found she could talk to him best when she was in short skirts and had her dog whip, and she gesticulated with that, and was always a little contemptuous and shrill. But sometimes the vicar played master, a minute, middle-aged, rather breathless David, pelting a childish Goliath with reproof and reproach and dictatorial command. The monster was now so big that it seemed it was impossible for any one to remember he was after all only a child of 7, with all a child's desire for notice and amusement and fresh experience, with all a child's craving for response, attention, and affection, and all a child's capacity for dependence and unrestricted dullness and misery. The vicar, walking down the village road some sunlit morning, would encounter an ungainly 18 feet of the inexplicable, as fantastic and unpleasant to him as some new form of descent, as it padded fitfully along with craning neck, seeking, always seeking, the two primary needs of childhood, something to eat and something with which to play. There would come a look of furtive respect into the creature's eyes, and an attempt to touch the matted forelock. In a limited way the vicar had an imagination, at any rate the remains of one, and with young Cattles it took the line of developing the huge possibilities of personal injury such vast muscle must possess. Suppose a sudden madness, suppose a mere lapse in disrespect. However, the truly brave man is not the man who does not feel fear, but the man who overcomes it. Every time and always the vicar got his imagination under, and he used to always address young Cattles stoutly in a good clear service tenor. "Being a good boy, Albert Edward?" And the young giant, edging closer to the wall and blushing deeply, would answer, "Yes, sir, trying." "Mind you do," said the vicar, and would go past him with at most a slight acceleration of his breathing. And out of respect for his manhood he made it a rule, whatever he might fancy, never to look back at the danger when once it was past. In a fitful manner the vicar would give young Cattles private tuition. He never taught the monster to read, it was not needed, but he taught him the more important points of the catechism, his duty to his neighbour for example, and of that deity who would punish Cattles with extreme vindictiveness if ever he ventured to disobey the vicar and Lady Wondershoot. The lessons would go on in the vicar's yard, and passers-by would hear that great cranky childish voice droning out the essential teachings of the established church. "To honour and obey the king, and all other put authority under him. To submit myself to all my governors, teachers, spurs all shall pastors and masters. To order myself lowly and reverently to all my betters." Presently it became evident that the effect of the growing giant on unaccustomed horses was like that of a camel, and he was told to keep off the high road, not only near the shrubbery, where the oafish smile over the wall had exasperated her ladyship extremely, but altogether. That law he never completely obeyed, because of the vast interest the high road had for him, but it turned what had been his constant resort into a stolen pleasure. He was limited at last almost entirely to old pasture in the downs. I do not know what he would have done if it had not been for the downs. There were spaces where he might wander for miles, and over these spaces he wandered. He would pick branches from trees and make insane vast nosegays there until he was forbidden, take up sheep and put them in neat rows, from which they immediately wandered. At this he invariably laughed very heartily, until he was forbidden, dig away the turf, great wanton holes, until he was forbidden. He would wander over the downs as far as the hill about Rexstone, but no farther, because there he came upon cultivated land, and the people, by reason of his depredations upon their root crops, and inspired moreover by a sort of hostile timidity his big unkempt appearance frequently evoked, always came out against him with yapping dogs to drive him away. They would threaten him and lash at him with cart whips. I have heard that they would sometimes fire at him with shotguns, and in the other direction he ranged within sight of Hickley Brow.
From above Thursley Hanger he could get a glimpse of the London, Chatham, and Dover Railway, but